So hello and welcome to this video on the Tiptop Audio Fold Processor. Let's check out a bit of what's to come before we get into what this is, the features and the sound. So the Fold Processor is a wavefolder inspired by and based around ideas developed by Serge. And I remember Ger telling me this at Superbooth a couple of years ago, and it's got that same organic, woody kind of character that you find in some of the Serge synth designs. We've got two inputs. These will sum together. We have a folder mount, a CV input overfold with an attenuator, an inject, which controls the symmetry. It injects a voltage, be it negative or positive, as an offset, and will actually shape and move this wave. They'll give us even more tone control, again with a CV input and attenuator. We have our main output, and we have a subdivided output. So that gives us divide by 1, which is no division, because divide by 1 is whatever is the input. Divide by 2 for an octave lower, divide by 4 for an octave lower again, and even lower on divide by 8. Now you may think, why is there divide by 1 if it's not actually doing any octave shifting? Now the divide by 1 and all of the subdivided output are square and pulse based waveforms. It squares off that input wave and then derives extra additional pulses in the square wave or pulse wave train, if you like, because you get this series of pulses that we'll see in a second. And they PWM and modulate, and these pulses kind of kick in almost like locking into harmonics based on the fold level. So we'll see that shortly, but first let's get a sine wave into the input. That's this green trace on the Mordax data. And then let's take our output from the main output. Inject in the middle. Let's hear the folding, and I'll just raise the fold level slowly. And you can hear it's got a great smooth sound. Let's do that a little bit faster. Now with a bit of folding, let's move the inject. Inject in the middle. And again, you see this symmetry change. And as I said, it almost looks like a PWM. Over the folded shape. Now the subdivided out will give us this square, but listen how it kind of locks onto the harmonics in the folding. The divide 2 will do this an octave lower. But you can mix these together. -4. With a bit of -1. You can see we get this great kind of train of stacked pulses that all modulate. inject. And running the subdivided out into a filter while you use the fold processor kind of right down the middle of your patch works great. Let's hear some basic modulation, which is going to be an LFO over the fold CV. And let's take that up to audio rates. Tuning that audio rate modulation in to a pitch relative to the input of the folder gives some great overtones. Let's try audio rate inject modulation. An absolutely amazing array of tones. Now let's get into some patches of this thing and see how it sounds in various musical contexts. So I've got this little patch set up with a kick drum, some modulated fold processor over a sine wave and some reverb. And let's just listen for a second. Losing the kick. Losing the verb. It sounds great, if I do say so myself. So let's lose the modulation and just check out what's actually going on here. Sine wave at the input, and it's going to sound very much like what we've just heard, sweeping this when we were going through the features and the sounds. So let's turn this back on. And using that inject to affect the symmetry, it's almost like a PWM, an adjustment of that tone. Again, as we heard earlier in the video. So the first thing I'm modulating this with is the fold depth, and that's with an envelope that's just been triggered by a random gate. Now I'm using a Turing machine. This is generating a pulse and some step TV that we'll use in a second. So first, envelope to fold. And with just very little bits of attenuation, or very little bits of signal with a lot of attenuation, there's these great organic plucky tones to be had. Playing with the inject just to find a shape that I like. A lot more low end there. And then I added this stepped random voltage to the inject. Now remove the fold modulation first. So this stepped random voltage is stepping through various settings. Adding the envelope to fold. And adding some of the step TV to inject. And the clicking is just coming from the hard changes at that inject input. We could smooth this out and get rid of them. Against the kick. And I just love this kind of chuggy, energetic rhythm that it's got. Into some reverb. So here we'll take a look at wavefolding some drums. And here's the end result, but we'll then work backwards. Here's the folded tone. Also modulated by a filter, which works really good when we mix it over the dry input drum sound. Works really good, works really well. I think that's what I meant to say. But it gives us this kind of funky little synth riff textural thing. Here's the dry drums on their own. 909-ish kick, some hats, and a clap. Nice and simple. So going into the wave folder, let's first remove the modulation. Come out of the high pass filter with no modulation. And let's just listen to folding the drums. And I love that kind of thumpy twang that wavefolders give kick drums. Oh, that's quite nice, just kind of cutting in and out because of that inject voltage. Let's try that against the dry sound as a bit of a parallel blend. Without it, it's really making that clap smack in a kind of weird gritty way, but it's taking a lot out of the kick. Back to just the wave folder. Let's try modulating fold. And I'm just sequencing this and inject. So there's this interesting kind of little weird sequence pattern that's on its own is quite strange. But again, come into the band pass out on this filter, making it resonant and modulating it with a sequence. That's quite interesting, inverting the sequence. Let's try that against the dry sound. And there's lots of little cool stuff going on. If this was me building a track, I'd want to record that out and sample some of these little chunks for rearranging. Modulating the filter positively with the sequence. So here's a moving wavetable drone processed through the fold processor. There's a couple of layers to this. Reverb, which is in stereo, so make sure you got headphones or good speakers on. This is the main output, doesn't have any reverb on it. We can see that as the blue trace on the Modx data. The green trace is the input. And I'm taking the subdivided output into a filter that's in bandpass mode and sweeping through these really rich overtones. And that's what was feeding the reverb. But first, let's check out the dry input sound, not through the fold processor or anything else. So we can hear the shifting wavetable in its dry state. Now through the fold processor, and I'll first just get rid of my modulation. We can really thicken that up with some folding. It takes these tame or rich, lush or soft and delicate, whatever you want to say, wavetables that, alright, have some high harmonics, but they don't have any kind of grit and real energy. And really fold in a lot of overtones. So here's the subdivided output. Really rich and full on. Let's put that into the scope. You can see these intense moving pulses. filtering that, and at the minute it's high pass. Let's just really tame this. So let's take this into a bandpass filter and modulate the filter. Run that into a reverb to create some stereo width. So that's just one layer. Getting rid of that. The main output again. Let's animate the folding. So the incoming wave is a modulated wavetable. The folding is modulated. The inject is modulated. The subdivided out is going into a filter that's been modulated into some verb. And all together, we get this great kind of vast sonic landscape of folded wavetable drones. It marries up with complex waves really well. So in this patch, we're going to look at using the fold processor to process sub-audio CV signals. And we'll start with LFOs. Here's my sound and what's going to be happening. I have a waveform into a filter, into a little bit of reverb, and I'll just sweep this off camera. Slightly driven filter, and it's band pass in response. Now before we even plug anything in, and this green trace will be the LFO that I'll use, but it's currently not coming into anything on the fold processor, we can generate some voltage by playing with the inject without any input. So without any input, just modulating that should be good fun. So let's try that. We'll use the triangle wave into the inject CV. So there's already some interesting and quite creative modulations in terms of these different rates of wobble and hold that this fold processor is giving us. Now let's try this LFO at the input. And we certainly don't get the LFO that's coming in. Let's put a sample and hold into the fold amount. Let's try the sample and hold into inject. So we can use the fold processor to process or generate CV without an input, and then we could be quite creative with this new modulation that's not just the basic LFO that we've plugged in. Let's try using an envelope through the fold processor. And we can see the envelope on the top of the screen. Let's try this into inject. This is quite a unique shape. Because we've got a fast attack, we're getting this fast little burst of sound and then a kind of wobble that tapers down with the envelope. So again, it's a great way to be creative with your modulations. Let's try this into the input. almost like the envelope excites this unique little one-shot descending rate LFO. It's really cool. So here we've got a rather nice little kick, or big deep kick with extra stuff added. Here's the dry sound, completely unrelated to the fold processor. And this is the filter 8 from Geranalog, self-oscillating, just with an envelope to exponential FM. Now get the envelope shape and time, and that tight exponential curve, that's the important bit for me while sculpting my own kick sounds. You get that right and you've got a good kick. Now I wanted to use the fold processor in a more subtle way to just add extra click to make sure this really smacks through a mix when there's other drums and bass sounds and other things on top in this kind of wider modular patch that could potentially be there. So here's what the fold processor's doing on its main output. Now I remove the second input, which is the higher sound, and it's just giving me this kind of clicky sound. So here's the dry sound, and then added fold processor click. Let's play around with the fold and inject. Now of course there's a lot of great tones to be had just layering in folded sine waves from this kick. But again, it clicking, really helps kind of make that thump through. Now one thing that I can do, and here's the folded out on its own, is use that second input, and here's a high pitch wave, almost like a weird cowbell overtone, but again against the dry sound. It's quite an interesting way to add an extra layer to a kick. Now that's quite subtle for the fold processor, but when you're designing your own synth sounds and you want to go that extra mile, it's a nice tip for getting extra harmonics and click and thump and interesting little transients and glitches to mix in against your dry drum sounds. So here's a patch with the fold processor that I like to use to create a stereo image. I have my sound coming in, again this is just a sine wave, it's an oscillating filter again, and I've got the main output panned left, and this is going through its own low pass gate channel. I have the subdivided out panned right, going through its own low pass gate channel. I'm using two different gate rhythms to strike the low pass gate, so they're already rhythmically independent on the left and right. Obviously put some headphones on to hear this properly, but we've got the sub square waves on one side, the nice organic woody plucky folder on the other. So let's just have a play around. I'm going to keep the modulation down for now. So tonal differences, obviously octave differences with this dividing. Let's modulate the fold with an envelope. And we can hear, if I mute the left side, that kind of locking onto the harmonics and those little pulses appearing in the sub output, as we've seen earlier in the video, creates this nice little glitch kind of sound. Bring the left side back in. So just a quick patch to show how I like to use this to create a stereo image, and then use two different low pass gates, panned hard left and right, with two independent gate rhythms to get a stereo image from an otherwise really basic sequence. So for this final patch in the video, I wanted to do something a little bit more abstract and a bit more experimental in nature. And this whole thing is generated from a single triangle LFO which is the green trace on the Mordax data. Now this is coming out into the fold processor, and I'm taking the subdivided output, which at sub-audio LFO low CV ranges won't actually divide and create proper pulses. We get this kind of almost charging, discharging kind of spike to the waveform. And what I'm using is the output of this blue trace over to ping an almost oscillating filter that's coming through this wave animator. If I just back it off, you can hear fairly classic pinged filter sounds. If I wanted to drive it, add some wave animation on this wave swarm, creates these nice kind of buzzy saw-like swells of sound using the wave swarm. That's coming in some reverb and being recorded. But what I'm also doing is taking this output and moving a sequencer. I'm then using a divider to change another clock to move the sequencer, and we've got this nice movement on the make noise rene, and I'll get a little shot of that and overlay it over this part of the video. So triangle wave, creating these weird spikes on the subdivided out, that's pinging an oscillating filter, and those positive going spikes are also driving changes on a sequencer. Nice kind of evolving, not really generative I guess, but more experimental patch, and probably a way that you wouldn't think to patch up a fold processor or a wavefolder. So thanks for watching this video on the Tiptop Audio Fold Processor. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all the usual stuff. Be great to hear how you're using wavefolders, both in normal, classic kind of ways or more abstract ways. We can chat in the comments if you'd like. Go support me on Patreon if you'd like extra content and bonuses. If not, that's cool. Cheers for watching. All the links and sections in the description if you want to skip through anything. Cheers.